Brexit. Instead of speculating the future of Brexit in this video, I thought I'd take a look back at the history of the people running this country, Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn.
What's your view about the referendum issue?
More of that clip from 2012 later, but first we've got to go back to 1980 when Jeremy Corbyn was a junior MP.
Is that the jumper that your mum made?
Yes, it is. It's not the euthanasia, it's the rebirth in many senses of a serious thinking left that's looking forward beyond the 80s, that's looking forward to the serious economic issues the next Labour government's going to have to face. If we run away from them,
already,
the next Labour government will be weakened.
A scruffy, socialist, far-left backbencher who could foresee an economic decline in Britain.
But above all, I think we should also be considering the actions and attitudes of a number of left Labour MPs in Parliament.
This was not a man that fit with every member of his own party. By the time the 90s came about, the single currency was the issue being debated in Parliament.
Does the Prime Minister agree with the Treasury Select Committee that it will take at least 5 years to assess whether the government's own economic tests for participation in the single currency have been met?
My concern is that we need to be very robust against the conditions for the single currency. Single currency would lead to enormous cuts in public expenditure in Britain and a very rapid rise in unemployment. Now, he appeared to make some tilt in that direction. The other one is a concern about democracy in Europe. We have a European bureaucracy totally unaccountable to anybody. Powers have gone from national parliaments, they haven't gone to the European Parliament, they've gone to the Commission and to some extent to the Council of Ministers. These are quite serious matters.
There will be economic growth to compensate.
Well, I've heard that argument before, but the reality is we have more poor in Europe per head than almost any other country. The number of people in real poverty is increasing, and the kind of cuts in public expenditure envisaged by the Maastricht criteria would lead to a massive increase in poverty and unemployment in Britain. You cannot wait for growth. You have to deal with the issue of poverty now.
While Mr Corbyn was the man willing to step away from his party's policies, Mrs May was the woman willing to defend them. And so when you look at some of these old clips, she eats a lot of her words.
As you say, the NHS is in a crisis and does have a real problem. There aren't enough nurses. The government has put a lot of money into it, and yet what do we see? We see that the waiting times to get on the waiting list are going up.
OK, well, what about the 40 million?
I just think that for a whole generation of people, they thought that if they arrived and did well, then you became a Tory. You know, it's like people used to say, well, if you bought your house, if you owned your own home, you were a Tory, which is crazy stuff.
In today's world, it seemed odd to have unprincipled, mixed politicians, but in Blair's 1997 election, it was hugely popular.
Maybe 10,000 Iraqis have died as a result of that war. Several hundred American and British soldiers have died.
Yes, I think the government has lost control of its immigration and asylum policy, frankly. I think we see a degree of chaos in what is happening, and what is perfectly clear from what has taken place and been admitted by the government and by Beverly Hughes in particular at the beginning of this week is that we have in this government ministers who simply don't know what is going on in their department. We have departments that deny the truth and have to have it dragged out of them.
Well, the defence cuts were made in the atmosphere of post-Cold War Europe, and there were reductions in defence expenditure in most European countries. After 1990, 2001, there was a huge increase in defence expenditure in the United States after the start of the Afghanistan war, and Britain followed suit.
Britain's failed foreign interventions created all kinds of problems for the country.
In November last year, it became apparent that certain border security checks had been suspended without ministerial approval. As a result, the head of the UK Border Force was suspended with immediate effect, full controls were reinstated, and I commissioned John Vine, the independent Chief Inspector of the UK Border Agency, to report on what had happened. Today I have laid the report before the House, and copies will be available from the Vote Office. The Vine report reveals that security checks carried out at the border have been suspended regularly and applied inconsistently since at least 2007. Warnings index checks were not carried out on European Economic Area nationals travelling to the UK on Eurostar services from a number of French resorts. This is likely to have resulted in 500,000 EEA nationals not being checked against the warnings index. A vote voting for Labour to get back into government is a vote for 5 more years of Gordon Brown's debt, waste and taxes, more of the same, whereas voting for the Conservatives is a vote for the change that I believe the country needs. And when we set our manifesto out today, we showed the clear difference between us in that the Labour government's approach over the last 13 years has always been that government knows best, that government has all the answers. We believe government doesn't have all the answers. No one government can have all the answers to all the problems that people are facing today. We are all in this together. There's a role for government, but there's a role for people and communities, for businesses, social enterprises, for charities. We all need to be involved in this. We all need to work together to find the solutions to the problems that we face.
But while Labour were being attacked about their economic policy following the financial crash of 2008, it was the Conservatives that were being attacked about their immigration policies.
Immigration, which lots of people are very, very exercised about. There is a reference there to immigration from outside the EU, and we all understand the limits on what you can do within the EU. That's quite clear. Do you think you're really dealing with this in as robust a way as people would like, given that in all these surveys we see, immigration is right up there as, you know, if not the first thing on the list, second or third?
Here's another case of Theresa May eating her words.
And history shows us, doesn't it, that once a party is so busy looking inwards and in itself fighting, it never really recovers, does it? Is the answer for a general election?
Well, we believe, because of the state that things are in at the moment, that we should have a general election, because the government clearly isn't doing the job that they're supposed to be doing. They're far too busy looking at their own issues. They're far too busy fighting amongst themselves, looking internally, not considering the problems that the country is facing. Britain's been in the longest and deepest recession on record. We've got the worst budget deficit of any developed country, and of course we're the last G20 country out of recession, and getting a credible plan for dealing with the budget deficit is absolutely crucial, because if the government doesn't come forward with a credible plan, then we would see higher interest rates, higher taxes, and of course, as a result, slower growth.
The financial crash and the deficit gave the Tories an excuse for austerity and cuts to public services.
What matters is not the total number of officers employed, but the total number of officers deployed and how effectively they are deployed.
But it was immigration that was slowly bubbling up as the primary issue in the UK.
We've introduced the annual cap on non-EU economic migration. We're also already looking at what we can do for student visas to get rid of the abuse that takes place. We're also going to make some changes in relation to settlement and to family visas as well.
You must have seen estimates in your department about what these measures, the ones we've been talking about, will do in terms of net immigration. So how many fewer immigrants do you expect to come into this country as a result of what you're announcing tomorrow?
Well, this is not big numbers, the family migration, which is why, as I've made the point, this isn't just about numbers for family migration. It is about setting out clearly the rules in relation to Article 8, which we can talk about in a little while, but it's also about some pretty important principles, I think, about people being able to support themselves.
I'll come back to numbers.
It's not in itself about numbers, because the really large numbers, what makes the major difference in terms of the overall net migration, is in student visas.
Yes, and there's been lots of issues around that. Well, let's talk about Article 8, which affects people who you want to remove from the country, but you can't remove from the country at the moment, because they are going to court and saying, I have a right to family life, I have married this person, or I have got this child, and therefore whatever I've done as a convicted criminal in this country, you can't get rid of me. That's the essence of the trouble, yes?
The problem is that Article 8 is in the European Convention on Human Rights.
Yes.
Complying to the European Convention on Human Rights is still under the withdrawal agreement, by the way, because it still applies under the Good Friday Agreement.
And if you look at it in the Convention, there are two parts to it. The first part basically says you have a right to a private and family life, and the second part says that actually states, governments can qualify that right. Mm-hmm. This is not an absolute right. So in the interests of the economy or of controlling migration or of public order and those sorts of issues, the state has a right to qualify this right to a family life. Now, what's been happening up till now is we've seen cases going through our courts where people who are criminals, who we want to deport, have been able to stay in the UK because the courts have said, no, you have this right to a family life. And they haven't been qualifying it, even, I think, in the way that the European Convention enables them to do. And so what I'm going to do is actually set out the rules that say this is what Parliament, this is what the public believe, is how you balance the public interest against the individual's interest.
But given that we're signatories to this, act, this international agreement, it's impossible, isn't it, for Parliament to change the effective law when it comes to this area?
But Parliament isn't changing it. What Parliament is doing, what we will ask Parliament to do, is to set out the qualifications which we are entitled to set out under the European Convention itself. And one of the interesting things is, if you look at some of the cases that we've seen, there are some instances where the European court's actually been tougher than our own courts. For example, our own courts tend not to look at whether somebody's been here for a number of years lawfully or illegally,
yes.
Whereas the European Court actually takes a tougher view on those who've built up so-called rights over a period of time when they've been here illegally. They says, actually, you should pay less attention to that. So what we're doing is taking what is in the Convention itself and saying it's right that we actually apply this in Parliament. Now, as I say, this doesn't get the big numbers. I think it's important to do this on Article 8. In terms of net migration overall, where we are seeing the differences in the student visas, and we've seen a significant fall in those.
And that's really coming down. What's your view about the referendum issue? Because if, as appears now quite likely, the Eurozone takes deeper measures, brings itself closer together and creates a stronger core, that will greatly affect what Europe means, and it will therefore affect our relationship with the rest of the EU. And many, many Conservatives feel that at that moment, the promise of a referendum can no longer be ignored.
Well, we've done something that no government has done previously. When we came in, we passed legislation, we've passed an Act of Parliament that says that if there's a treaty which requires powers to be taken from Britain to Brussels, then there will be a referendum and the British people will have their say. And we think that's important. Now, we don't know what's going to come out of the current discussions. As a government, we have said...
But you're watching this like a hawk, and you must see that that's the way things are moving.
Well, we've been very clear that very clear for some time, and George Osborne has reiterated that today, that we think that for those countries that are in the Eurozone, there is an inevitability about them having more collective responsibility in certain areas, and an inevitability about certain pooling of their support for each other.
And that inevitability means inevitably changes to the arrangements, which inevitably would trigger a referendum, no?
We don't know what changes to the arrangements it means in terms of the European Union as a whole, all the member states within the European Union. But as I say, if a treaty... We've been very clear in the legislation that if there is a treaty that requires powers to go from Britain to Brussels, then there would be a referendum and the British people would have their say.
This was the start of blaming immigration for Britain's problems. Instead of blaming the opposition or the migrants themselves, the government started to blame the European Union. And so Euroscepticism rose up in British society. But it's worth remembering, this is the government that also created the Windrush scandal.
We want to ensure that only legal migrants have access to the labour market, free health services, housing, bank accounts and driving licences. And this is not just about making the UK a more hostile place for illegal migrants, it is also about fairness. What happened was that the things that you claim that the Federation in the past claimed were going to happen didn't happen. Policing was not destroyed when you said policing was going to be destroyed.
The destruction of public services, a mismanagement of migration, it became clear that the centre-right of politics had completely lost it. Their government had been in power for more years now. It became more and more difficult to blame the opposition. Eventually, they got desperate, as these next two clips illustrate.
But obviously, of course, a lot of attention has been focused this summer on the migration crisis in Europe, on the issue of Syrian refugees. And that's why I devoted quite a portion of my speech to talking about how we can offer help, as we traditionally have done, and can proudly say that we have done in the past as the United Kingdom, to those in need of our protection from persecution.
Another failed British foreign intervention, this time in Syria. But look at how much Theresa May's language changes from this year to the next.
Because what we see is that a lot of people coming are economic migrants, but they are people who are paying criminal gangs, paying criminals to transport them across Africa. These criminals are then putting them into vessels which they know very often are not seaworthy.
Criminals entering the country. It didn't paint a good message. So with Labour destroyed, the left were going even more far left.
For many people who crave authenticity, Jeremy Corbyn is the real deal. This place may look affluent and leafy, but there's a lot of urban poverty, and he has been, over years, a tireless campaigner for those people. But for others in the Labour Party, he is terrifyingly left-wing. One former cabinet minister told me today, antediluvian doesn't begin to cover it when you get to Jeremy Corbyn. Another said if he took over, it would be the party led by Karl Marx. One senior figure said to me that if Jeremy Corbyn took over, they'd leave the party.
Jeremy Corbyn, the antithesis of Tony Blair, now leads his party.
I say thank you in advance to us all working together to achieve great victories, not just electorally for Labour, but emotionally for the whole of our society, to show we don't have to be unequal, it doesn't have to be unfair, poverty isn't inevitable, things can and they will change.
Britain needed a strong anti-establishment figure, and Jeremy Corbyn was the man. But it didn't stop the divide within the party and eventually within the country.
I still believe that if the centre puts forward strong radical solutions, but which are based on what I would call, solutions that align with the future, I still think that position beats everything else. For most of my political life, I've been saying, I think this is the right way to go, and what's more, it's the only way to win an election.
Over the years, I and many others have been very critical of many decisions taken by the EU. And I remain very critical of its shortcomings, from its lack of democratic accountability to the institutional pressures to deregulate or privatise public services. So, Europe needs to change. But that change can only come from working with our allies in the European Union to achieve it.
When the EU referendum campaign began, nobody believed the bureaucratic elites of the European Union are people that he favoured. On the right of politics was of course this ongoing immigration concern. Plus, the country simply had a need to vote against the establishment, and the country feared the economic and political future of the European Union. And so Leave won the EU referendum and Theresa May became Prime Minister.
I have just been to Buckingham Palace, where Her Majesty the Queen has asked me to form a new government, and I accepted. Because not everybody knows this, but the full title of my party is the Conservative and Unionist Party. And that word unionist is very important to me. It means we believe in the union, the precious, precious bond between England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland.
Ultimately, Brexit broke the union, not just in the Labour Party, but in the Conservative Party and the Union of Northern Ireland and possibly Scotland as well.
The political fallout following Britain's historic decision to quit the EU continued on Tuesday after Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn refused to resign, despite overwhelmingly losing a no-confidence motion by his party's MPs.
The squabbles now have made the party look unelectable, and both of you look unelectable. You should stand aside and let somebody else, maybe Harry Arm and someone like that, somebody, just anybody, lead the party to victory. Otherwise, it's 10 more years of Conservative government that nobody wants, especially not you two, I'm sure. So stand aside.
Well, thanks for your vote of confidence. I really appreciate it.
Corbyn lost a vote of no confidence and faced a leadership election, and that ultimately highlighted the divisions within the party. But don't think that just because Jeremy Corbyn won this leadership contest, that the divisions within the party have been resolved.
But every vote for me and my team will strengthen my hand in these crucial negotiations, so we can move forward together as a country, through Brexit and beyond.
When Theresa May lost seats in her election, it ultimately divided up her party more by giving her less of a majority in Parliament. Now that Corbyn had won his leadership contest, Brexit created a huge problem for Labour. How does the left control immigration?
We've long argued that a customs union is a viable option for the final deal. So Labour would seek to negotiate a new, comprehensive UK-EU customs union to ensure there are no tariffs with Europe and to help avoid any need whatsoever for a hard border in Northern Ireland.
I wholeheartedly apologise.
Yesterday, the MP Naz Shah was suspended by Labour and apologised to MPs for suggesting on social media 2 years ago that Israel should be moved en bloc from the Middle East to the US. But today, Jeremy Corbyn's close friend Ken Livingstone made Labour's crisis far worse when he tried to defend Shah on the radio. She'd gone over the top, he said, but wasn't anti-Semitic.
These were two polar opposite sides of politics, willing to vote against each other no matter what.
If Parliament votes down a Tory deal, or the government fails to reach any deal at all, we would press for a general election.
They're hungry for an election not in their gift. But hang on, what about the painstakingly agreed referendum policy compromise? Ah, yes, eventually, for those listening carefully.
Failing that, all options are on the table.
And then perhaps the core surprise of the speech, what sounded like an offer to back up the Prime Minister he is trying to remove.
But let me also reach out to the Prime Minister. You see, I reach out to everybody who's currently apparently doing the negotiations. If you deliver a deal that includes a customs union and no hard border in Ireland, if you protect jobs, people's rights at work and environmental and consumer standards, then we will support that sensible deal, a deal that would be backed by most of businesses in the world and trade unions. But if you can't negotiate that deal, then you need to make way for a party that can and will.
For Labour, it wasn't just a case of remain or leave anymore. It was remain and therefore accept that Europe can sometimes be elitist and bureaucratic, or leave and therefore risk being hostile towards immigrants, both of which disagree with Labour core policy. But for the Tories, it was equally the same. You either leave, and therefore you're able to go around the world economically independent as a country, getting trade deals and controlling immigration, or you remain and secure the economy by supplying the financial sector with a single market and customs union. But it was Northern Ireland that made Theresa May's deal get voted down in Parliament.
On the sheer incompetence of this government and pass that motion of no confidence in the government.
The ayes to the right, 306. The noes to the left, 325.
Tonight, the House rejected the government's deal, emphatically. A week ago, the House voted to condemn the idea of a no-deal Brexit. Before there can be any positive discussions about the way forward, the government must remove clearly, once and for all, the prospect of the catastrophe of a no-deal Brexit from the EU and all the chaos that would come as a result of that. And the House has emphatically voted to reject the no-deal option that the Prime Minister was supporting. Could I say that we are prepared to meet her, to put forward the points of view from the Labour Party of the kind of agreement we want with the European Union to protect jobs, to protect living standards and to protect rights and conditions in this country. It's exactly the offer that was made last September, exactly the offer that was made 2 weeks ago, and I look forward to meeting the Prime Minister to set out those views to her on behalf of my party.
Yes, difficult and sometimes uncomfortable decisions have had to be made. I understand fully that there are some who are unhappy with those compromises. But this deal delivers what people voted for, and it is in the national interest. And we can only secure it if we unite behind the agreement reached in Cabinet yesterday.
But what do you think is the state of British politics, and how do you see yourself voting in the next election? Join in the debate below and subscribe.